You didn't ask for this. But you nodded when your father told you the match was good. You let the women dress you in linen and braid your hair. You said the words at the altar even though they shook in your mouth like loose teeth. Now you sit on the edge of a straw-stuffed mattress, knees locked together, fingers clenched in your lap. The room is dim, the fire's gone low, but the hallway behind the door is loud. They are waiting. Not for the feast to end, not for morning light. They are waiting for you, to scream, to bleed, to prove. The bed was made up hours ago. Fresh rushes, white sheets, a basin of water nearby to cleanse what needs cleansing. The priest blessed it earlier, just after blessing the wine. But what matters most is missing. The curtains, the thick wool drapes that once hung from the bedposts, meant to keep in warmth, or modesty, or dreams, have been removed. Not torn, not stolen, just taken down, folded neatly, and placed in the corner of the room. You asked your maid why. She didn't answer. She just tied the last ribbon around your waist and left without meeting your eyes. You already know why. Tonight is not about privacy. It's about performance. He enters the room smelling of sweat and smoke. Not drunk, but dulled. He doesn't speak right away. He doesn't need to. His boots are still dusty from the hall. His belt is loose. You flinch as he closes the door behind him, but it doesn't click shut. It's left slightly ajar on purpose, because the guests are outside waiting to listen, waiting for the bed to move, waiting for the girl to cry out, waiting for the sound that will tell them a marriage has truly begun. Your husband sits beside you and exhales. He's not cruel, just tired, just following tradition, just doing what's expected. So are you. He unties the ribbon. You don't look at him when your shift slips down your shoulders. You look at the wall. The plaster is cracked. There's a spider in the corner. He touches you with hands that are rough but not unkind. You wonder if he thinks of you as a person or as proof. Because outside that door they are smiling and whispering, placing bets, drinking from jugs, eating from trenchers. Some will place their ears to the wood to hear better. Some will wait to inspect the sheets. Not because they want to shame you, but because this is how it's done. The consummation of marriage isn't a private exchange, it's a contract witnessed through walls, and if there's no blood, no sound, no trembling after, then the union can be questioned. The dowry reversed. Your body returned like spoiled goods, so you grit your teeth, you try to cry, you make a sound that doesn't belong to you, and when it's done, you lie still while he reaches for the cloth. He presses it between your thighs, not tenderly, carefully, because it's not for you, it's for them. The door opens, the cloth is passed. You hear the cheer before you even sit up. It's over, and yet you know it isn't. Because tomorrow they'll expect you to walk into the chapel smiling, to sit at the feast like nothing happened, to become a wife in the eyes of God and man and law and legend. But something inside you is quiet now. Too quiet. They call it honour. They call it tradition. They call it union. But tonight you learnt the truth. In the medieval world, intimacy was never private. It was always public, always political, always terrifying. If stories like this make you stop and wonder, thank you for being here. It means something to know we're looking at the past together, not as a list of dates, but as a map of human pain, survival, and strange customs that still echo in us today. If you'd like to explore more forgotten truths like this one, feel free to subscribe or tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Even across time zones, across centuries, curiosity connects us. The morning after, you're no longer just a girl, you're a wife, a witness, a piece of evidence. Because what happened in the bedroom last night wasn't just between two people, it was a ceremony. And like all medieval ceremonies, it required an audience. Not in the room, at least not always, but outside it, just beyond the door, ears pressed to wood, fingers crossed for confirmation. They called it the bedding ceremony. And it was as real as the wedding vows, more real even, because words could lie, but a body told the truth. After the feast, the guests would lift the bride and groom from their chairs and carry them to bed. cheering, laughing, singing songs that weren't meant for children's ears. Sometimes they stripped the couple as they walked. Sometimes they only pulled away a sleeve or unlaced a bodice for luck, but always they followed. Because it wasn't enough to see them married. You had to see, or hear, the marriage consummated. In some towns, the noble families would wait just outside the chamber door. In others, they were invited in, to pray, to place a hand on the headboard, to sit at the edge of the bed until the candles burned low. In one French court, it was customary for the king's own mother to remain in the room while the new queen fulfilled her duty. She was meant to comfort, but everyone knew she was there to confirm. Some customs were gentler. The bride and groom would be left alone but required to ring a bell when it was done. Others were brutal. The couple had to produce the bloody sheet before dawn. If there was no blood, the whispers began. Maybe the bride was not a virgin. Maybe the groom couldn't perform. Maybe the union wasn't real. The stakes weren't emotional, they were legal. A marriage without consummation could be annulled. That meant the dowry would be returned. Land grants revoked. Alliances dissolved. So families didn't take chances. They hired midwives to inspect the bride before the wedding. Fingers, not questions. They arranged for matrons to stay nearby during the first night, listening for gasps, cries, anything to signal completion. Sometimes, if the groom was too drunk, a servant would be sent in to help. In rare cases, when doubts arose, the church itself got involved. Clerical courts would summon both husband and wife for interrogation. They would ask questions, graphic ones. What position was used? What did the bride say when it happened? How did the groom finish? Was there resistance? Was there blood? They would examine the woman for signs of penetration. Sometimes they examined the man. Sometimes they questioned the servants, the neighbours, even the musicians at the feast. Because intimacy was never private, it was part of the contract, and contracts demanded witnesses. The most grotesque variation came from parts of Scandinavia, where the first bedding was public theatre. The couple would lie beneath a blanket while elders stood nearby, offering instructions like farmers overseeing livestock. The goal wasn't pleasure, it was proof. In villages, the pressure was worse. Poor families couldn't afford written contracts or priestly blessings, so they relied on community recognition. A neighbour's testimony held more weight than a seal. If the neighbour didn't hear the bride scream, if the groom didn't brag at the tavern the next morning, if the sheet didn't hang in the window with its crimson smear, then the marriage might not be honoured. And the bride, she bore the blame, so she learned to bite her lip until it bled, to dig her nails into her own skin if she had to make it real, even if it wasn't. Because failure meant shame. Shame meant exile. Exile meant death. The bedding ceremony was supposed to be a celebration, but for many it was a public trial in the shape of a ritual. A trial where the body was both the defendant and the evidence, and there were always too many eyes watching. You didn't think the priest would follow you into the bedroom, but he did. Not with feet, with rules. You never saw him, but you felt him there. When your husband reached for you on a Wednesday and you hesitated. When he touched you during Advent and you whispered, "Not tonight." When you bled and he turned away. When you didn't and he demanded. Because the church had a calendar for desire, and you were expected to obey it. There were days for sex, and many, many more days for silence. No intercourse on Sundays, or Fridays, or feast days, or during Lent, or during Advent, or after childbirth, or while menstruating, or while pregnant, or while nursing. If you followed the calendar strictly, there were about 80 permissible days per year, and that was assuming you wanted it, which of course you weren't supposed to. Because the church didn't just regulate when you could have sex, they regulated how. Face to face, man on top, no movement, no eye contact if possible, no pleasure. Theologians debated these things in cathedrals and confessionals, writing rules with ink and fear. St. Jerome warned that even a husband who loved his wife too much was guilty of adultery in his heart. St. Augustine believed that sexual desire itself was a result of original sin, that Adam and Eve, in their purest form, had mated with no lust at all. The great Thomas Aquinas wrote that any act done for pleasure alone, even within marriage, was a sin, a mortal one. Even the direction of the act mattered. One cleric argued that lying with your spouse facing east was dangerous because it mimicked sun worship. Another insisted that the act must occur in silence, under heavy blankets, with no lights. There were penitential manuals, handbooks for priests to assign punishments, and in them, entire sections dedicated to sex. If a man enters his wife from behind, let him fast for 40 days. If a woman mounts her husband, let them both be whipped. If they speak during the act, let them recite 3 psalms daily for a month. If they laugh, God have mercy. So people learned to hide their pleasure. Women were told not to moan. Men were warned not to finish too quickly. If either one cried out, neighbours might hear and assume sin, and sin, once suspected, never stayed private. There were cases, real ones, where couples were excommunicated because someone claimed to hear unnatural sounds from the room above. Sometimes it was enough to ruin a family. But even inside the church, things were not consistent. Priests heard confessions about the same sins they secretly committed. Some whispered absolution, others demanded public penance. Some punished what they desired in secret. Because behind all these rules was anxiety, not about God, about control. The church feared sex not because it was evil, but because it was powerful. It made people behave irrationally, break promises, defy fathers, forget poverty, ignore sermons, so they tried to contain it by branding it, measuring it, limiting it, and they called that morality. But what they really feared was the body itself. So women were told their wombs were unstable, that pleasure made them unclean, that desire made them demonic. Men were told their urges were beasts, that lust could shrink their soul, that finishing too often might drain their life force. In some abbeys, young monks were warned that touching themselves would summon the devil directly. In one cloister, a boy who confessed to a dream was made to fast for 7 weeks. He died on the 6th, and still, every night husbands reached for wives, and wives turned toward the wall, not because they hated them, but because they were afraid of getting pregnant, of being caught, of going to hell. Because even within marriage, even beneath rings and robes and vows, intimacy was watched, policed, judged, and the priest was always in the room, even when the door was closed. They say knowledge is power, but in the medieval world, knowledge about sex was a punishment waiting to happen. There were books, of course there were, hidden in monasteries, locked behind cathedral doors, not romances, not poetry, manuals, written by monks who had sworn celibacy, men who claimed to have never touched a woman but still wrote about how to make her fertile. These texts weren't filled with affection or desire. They were filled with rules, diagrams, warnings, lists of positions deemed acceptable, charts that aligned intercourse with the phases of the moon, instructions about when to touch, where to look, how long to last, and always what to avoid. Because sex, according to the manuals, was more than biology. It was a test, a trap, a gamble with your soul as the wager. Theologians like Albertus Magnus and Hildegard of Bingen wrote of male and female fluids as dangerous alchemical substances that could poison the air or infect a child with demonic traits if misaligned. They said a woman's orgasm was necessary for conception, that her womb would reject the seed if she didn't climax, that if she became pregnant after rape, it meant she must have secretly enjoyed it, and that belief didn't die in the margins, it passed into law, into courtrooms, into the hands of judges who weighed moans against morality. Meanwhile, stories of saints told children to fear their own bodies. Saint Agnes resisted marriage until she was stripped naked and paraded through the streets. And when the men looked at her, they were struck blind. Saint Cecilia laid beside her husband on their wedding night and whispered, "If you touch me, an angel will strike you down." Girls were told to pray to these women, to cover themselves in wool, to sleep on boards, to bite their tongues when they felt heat rise in their bellies. But even saints weren't protection enough, because the devil had his own methods. They taught you about the succubus, the female demon who would slip into your dreams and ride you until your soul spilled out. And the incubus, her male counterpart who forced himself on sleeping women and left them pregnant with cursed children. These weren't metaphors, they were facts, written into religious doctrine and medical theory alike. Doctors claimed they could spot a demon-born child by the colour of its eyes, or the shape of its toes, or the way it cried at baptism. And if a woman confessed to having such a dream, a dark figure pressing down on her chest, holding her still, whispering into her ear while she slept, they called it a pact, proof of sin, or worse, witchcraft. They didn't understand sleep paralysis. They didn't know the weight of trauma. They only saw the writhing, the sweat, the silence, and assumed guilt. Sometimes they said the devil took the shape of a husband. Sometimes a priest. Sometimes no shape at all. Just a heavy shadow and the smell of sulphur. To protect yourself, you could sleep with salt under your pillow, or a crucifix between your knees, or a rosary around your neck tight enough to remind you not to move. But even then, it didn't always work, because the devil wasn't always outside you. Sometimes, they said, he was in you, in your desire, in your dreams, in the flush of your cheeks and the damp between your thighs. So you fasted, you prayed, you whipped yourself in secret. You wore hair shirts beneath your clothes so the pain would distract you from your thoughts. And still, the dreams came, because you were human, because you wanted, because no one had ever told you it was okay to want. In the dark corners of the cloister and the castle alike, people whispered about sex demons, but no one whispered about love, or longing, or the ache for something soft, safe, and mutual. They believed in spirits that suffocated you in sleep, but not in a husband who touched you gently. They feared a phantom that stole your soul, but not a man who took your body without asking. So the manuals grew longer, the sermons louder, the confessions darker, and the rules piled up until they collapsed under their own weight. Because what they couldn't destroy, they tried to name. What they couldn't understand, they tried to punish. And what they couldn't stop, they called sin, even if it lived in everyone, even if it whispered in Latin, even if it felt like love. They didn't need to catch you in the act. Just the suggestion was enough. A glance held too long, a laugh that rose too easily, a blush that came too quickly when his name was mentioned. Desire wasn't just a feeling in the medieval world, it was a crime waiting to happen. You were taught that silence was safety, that stillness was virtue, that if your body ever stirred, your skin warmed, your breath hitched, your thoughts wandered, you had already sinned. Not with your hands, not with your mouth, just with your mind. There was a name for that, lustful imagination. Priests warned that a sinful thought could damn you as surely as a sinful act. And women were especially vulnerable, because they said your flesh was weak, your soul unstable, your blood too hot, your womb too wild. They warned that a woman who touched herself would go mad, that her fingers could summon demons, that her soul could slide down her spine and disappear forever. And yet, in quiet corners of convent gardens, in silent rooms behind shuttered windows, it happened. Because no sermon could stop the body from being a body. Some wrote prayers to resist temptation, others drank cold wine to numb their limbs, some beat their thighs with birch branches to scare away the heat, but others gave in, not loudly, not defiantly, softly, with shame, with trembling hands, with eyes squeezed shut so God wouldn't see. And when they confessed, they whispered, "I dreamed of my husband. I touched where I shouldn't. I imagined what it would be like to be wanted." Some priests forgave, others prescribed fasting, kneeling on stone, or silent prayer for 7 days. But what they feared most wasn't the sin, it was the pleasure, because pleasure meant control. And a woman in control of her pleasure was a woman not easily frightened. So pleasure had to be denied, or buried, especially if it didn't involve a man at all. The law had no mercy for women caught together. 2 handmaidens, a mistress and her seamstress, 2 novices in a convent found in a tangled sheet. There were no words for what they did, so the church made some up. Unnatural acts, demonic mimicry, bestial corruption. Punishments range from flogging to exile. In one monastery, 2 women were locked in separate cells for a year, fed only bread and water, not because they had confessed, but because someone saw them hold hands in the garden. For men it was worse. Sodomy was punishable by fire, by mutilation, by death. And yet, it persisted. Because intimacy isn't always about sex. Sometimes it's just someone listening when you speak. Sometimes it's a hand that lingers on your shoulder. Sometimes it's sleeping near someone without fear. And in a world where marriage was a transaction, where pleasure was sin, where even the priest in the confessional judged your dreams, those stolen, forbidden moments were all people had. But even those were dangerous. Men who kissed in secret might wake to find their beds stripped and their names posted in the town square. Women who smiled too brightly at other women might be forced into marriage as correction. In some towns, accusations were enough. Proof wasn't needed. Rumour alone could bury you. So people got good at hiding. They spoke in symbols, touched elbows instead of hands, passed notes under bread loaves, met at the edge of markets, looked at the moon instead of each other, and still the risk remained. Because the church had spies, the courts had ears, the world had rules, and love was not one of them. But even with the fear, even with the shame, even with the weight of damnation pressing down, desire never vanished. It crept through stone walls, it bloomed in candlelight, it hummed beneath robes and veils and armour. Not because people were evil, but because they were human, and their bodies remembered things they had never been taught, things no priest could erase. And when they were caught, the world didn't ask if it was love, or longing, or safety. The world only asked, who saw you? What did you do? And how loudly did you cry out? They called it medicine, but it looked more like exorcism, because in the medieval world the body, especially the female body, was a mystery people were desperate to control, and when they didn't understand something, they diagnosed it, named it, blamed it, and tried to burn it out. Doctors weren't what we think of today. Most couldn't read. Those who could studied scrolls copied from Roman texts or Arabic scholars, filled with guesswork disguised as truth. Their favourite theory? That a woman's womb was a wild animal, a creature that roamed her body like a trapped ghost, moving through organs, searching for heat. If it found none, they said, it would rise, up through the chest, into the throat, crushing the heart, strangling the voice. They called it hysterica passio, the wandering womb, the cure, smoke, perfume, flames beneath the bed. To lure the womb back down, they'd place sweet-smelling herbs near the genitals, lavender, myrrh, cinnamon. At the same time, they'd apply rotting meat or tar near the nose, to drive the womb away from the lungs and toward its rightful place. If the patient screamed, convulsed or fainted, the doctor declared it a success. If she didn't, she was said to be faking, or worse, possessed. But the womb wasn't the only problem. Too much sexual desire was labelled a disease. They called it furor uterinus, womb fury. Women who touched themselves, moaned in their sleep, or confessed to frequent dreams were said to be overheating. The cure was sometimes marriage, sometimes confinement, sometimes bleeding. A physician might take a lancet and open a vein near the ankle to release the excess heat. If that didn't work, they'd recommend applying leeches under the breasts, between the thighs, behind the ears, anywhere the blood might hide. Men weren't spared either. Too much ejaculation was thought to drain the soul. Monks were told that nocturnal emissions could shorten their lifespan, that each drop of seed contained life force, and that spilling it in dreams meant they were spiritually compromised. Some monasteries forced young men to sleep with rough rope beneath their robes, so if they stirred at night the rope would tighten, and the pain would wake them. One abbot prescribed ice baths 3 times a week. Another had a novice sleep with a stone on his stomach, to crush the thoughts out of him before they bloomed. Doctors also believed that the womb dried out if not properly irrigated, which meant a woman too long without sex might become ill. They called it uterine suffocation. Symptoms included melancholy, fainting, and muteness. The treatment? Penetration. Sometimes with a husband, sometimes with an object, sometimes, in horrific cases, with the doctor himself. They justified it by saying the body required balance, that fluids must flow, that desire must be released, or it would rot the woman from within. And when a woman refused, she was accused of resisting her own cure, a danger to herself, so she was bound, washed, cut, and if she wept, they said she was hysterical. If she screamed, they said she was cured. Even childbirth wasn't spared this madness. Doctors believed that pain during labour was punishment for Eve's sin, that a woman must suffer to atone, so when she begged for help she was ignored. When she passed out, they poured vinegar in her mouth. When she bled too much, they blamed her womb for being disobedient. Some were cut open without anaesthesia. Some were stitched with horsehair. Some were left to die so the baby could be saved, if the baby was a boy. And still, they called it healing, because they believed the body was a machine, and if a part malfunctioned, it had to be burned, bled, bound, or broken. No one asked if she wanted to be touched. No one asked what she felt. They only asked, is she fixed? Is she fertile? Is she ready to return to her duties? And if the answer was yes, the treatment was deemed a success, even if she never walked the same again, even if she never spoke another word, even if something inside her went permanently quiet. They didn't care what was lost, only what could be used. Because in medieval medicine, intimacy wasn't something to nurture, it was something to correct. They said it was love, but the paperwork told a different story. In the medieval world, sex was rarely about desire. It was currency. You could use it to settle debts, to secure peace, to climb a ladder that had no rungs unless your body became one. From the highest courts of Europe to the poorest villages in winter, intimacy was a trade, negotiated, priced, and enforced. For royals, it started with treaties. A king would offer his daughter's hand to a rival monarch, not out of affection, but to prevent war. A duke might give his niece to a cousin to keep land within the family. A 15-year-old princess might be married to a 45-year-old warlord if it meant securing salt rights. And once the contract was sealed, the real proof came in the bed. Consummation wasn't a moment, it was a condition. No blood on the sheet, no alliance, no heir within a year. The bride could be returned, or locked away, or quietly removed and replaced. A noble woman's body wasn't hers, it was territory, to be claimed, conquered, inherited. And the men, they didn't fare much better. Younger sons were often expected to seduce widows to gain access to their estates. Courtiers were encouraged to entertain aging queens in exchange for favour. A well-timed affair could secure a title. A poorly timed one could get you beheaded. In taverns, the transaction was simpler. A cup of ale, a loaf of bread, a place to sleep, and in return, her hands, her mouth, her silence. Sometimes the women asked for nothing, because saying yes meant you might eat that night, because saying no meant you might not wake up. Brothels were both condemned and taxed. The church called them dens of sin. The city called them necessary infrastructure. In Paris, sex workers were required to register with the city. They had to wear specific colours, live in certain districts, obey curfews. But they were also protected sometimes, and punished, often. A woman caught soliciting outside the designated zones could be whipped in public. A prostitute who serviced a nobleman and then spoke of it could be drowned. But if that same nobleman fathered a child, the woman might be paid. Once. For peasant women, sex became negotiation. A sack of grain during a famine, a pair of shoes in winter, protection from a soldier during wartime, the unspoken price for survival. And sometimes it wasn't negotiation at all. During sieges, when cities fell, women were offered to enemy commanders in exchange for leniency. Some towns preemptively sent virgins to invading armies to spare the rest. They called it sacrifice, but it was always forced consent with a different name. Even within marriage, the body was part of the deal. A woman owed her husband sex, not affection, not joy, access. Refusing was a sin. Denying his rights could be used as grounds for annulment or punishment. Some husbands took concubines with the church's blessing, as long as the wife didn't bear a son. Others hired wet nurses and locked their wives away after childbirth, because their usefulness had been exhausted, because their value had changed. There are records of women sent back to their fathers like damaged goods, no longer virgins, not yet mothers, returned with bruises, with silence, with nothing, and yet the world kept calling it honour. They built statues to queens who produced heirs, wrote poems for mistresses who kept kings distracted, canonised virgins who died defending what others tried to buy. And for those who didn't play the game, who loved someone poor or barren or wrong, the punishment was exile, or shame, or fire, because love had no place in the market, and sex was a language of power. It was spoken in whispers in royal chambers, in screams behind cottage doors, in silence beneath convent veils, in coins passed beneath tables. It wasn't about connection, it was about possession. Not I want you, but I own you. Not I see you, but I bought you. And for those who tried to reclaim their bodies, who tried to choose, to ask, to say yes only when they wanted to, the world reminded them this was never yours to sell, only to be sold. The bed is cold now. The cheering is long gone. The sheets have been washed, the blood rinsed, the cloth dried and folded. The door is shut. The noise has faded, but something remains. Not silence, emptiness. You lie awake while he sleeps beside you, snoring softly into the crook of his arm. Not cruel, not kind, just finished. The window is cracked. The wind seeps through. You pull the blanket tighter, not for warmth, but for containment, as if wrapping yourself tightly enough might hold everything inside, everything that no one asked about. No one asked how it felt. No one asked if you were afraid, if you cried when they tied the ribbon too tight, if your knees trembled before he touched you, if the ache between your thighs was more than just skin. Because they didn't need to know. They only needed the answer to one question. Did it happen? Not, did you want it? Not, did you survive it? Just, was it done? And it was. So they moved on. The midwife returned to her herbs, the priest to his sermon, the guests to their gossip, your father to the land that was now safe in his name. And you stayed in that bed, in that room, in that body. And when morning came, you smiled. You smiled through the soreness. You smiled through the bruises. You smiled because you had been told that a quiet wife is a blessed wife, and that blessings do not bleed forever. You smiled because the ritual was complete. The sheet had spoken. The crowd had heard. The priest had nodded. And yet, something in you stayed folded, like the curtains they had taken away, because they never put them back. They never gave you back the part that closed, the part that separated you from the watchers, the part that said, "This moment is mine." They said it was union. They said it was holy. They said it was the first step into womanhood, into marriage, into grace. But you know better now. Because what they called intimacy was really performance. What they called duty was really obedience. And what they called love was really survival. What was left behind wasn't just blood on a cloth or a body that hurt. It was a truth you would never speak aloud, that you were never asked, only used, that you were never kissed, only claimed, that you were never held, only handled, and that no one ever called it what it truly was. Because if they did, they would have to face it. And facing it would mean admitting that the entire system, the whole structure built on contracts and curtains and customs and cloth, was not sacred, not holy, not blessed, just bizarre, brutal, broken. And all you could do was breathe in the morning light, brush the powder from your cheeks, and walk back into the world with the weight of that truth tucked somewhere inside your ribs, where no one would see it, but you would feel it. Every time someone said your name, every time someone called it love, every time you looked in the mirror and saw not a wife, but a witness.